Christmas Day in 1986, festive family traditions turned sinister when a 9-year-old Joel Hawke, a child fueled by sadness and jealousy, made a sinister deal with a mysterious man in the forest. As a child struggling to deal with these emotions surrounding his parents' recent divorce, Joel had no comprehension of the motives of this stranger or the evil that lurked in the place where a soul should be. But the choice that Joel made that day led to the disappearance of his cousin, Lenny Quinn, and that resulted in a lifetime of suppressed regret. Joel was so traumatized by what happened that he buried it deep in his subconscious. And it was only as an adult that these nightmares began. Blurred glimpses of what happened that day that his cousin vanished. Taunted by his fractured memories, Joel decided that the only way to end that nightmare was to unlock what happened all those years ago. So he underwent numerous therapy sessions to try and recount his memories. And this right here is Joel's account. It's retold from his sessions with his permission. The truth never changes, but sometimes some truths are so abhorrent that they're better off staying buried in the far reaches of the mind. Christmas as a child was always spent in Wyoming on my grandparents' ranch. It was in the wild, surrounded by these snow-covered mountains and clusters of spruce trees. And going there with my parents used to feel magical. It was a real winter wonderland, only this year was different. As a 9-year-old dealing with my parents' divorce, being there felt like I was in a different world entirely than my dad. The mere mention of him caused my mom to furrow her brows and grow flustered. It felt like the word dad was now a curse word. And suddenly everything that I had previously loved about Christmas, I now hated. And worst of all, my cousins were also at that ranch and, well, their parents were still very much together. I didn't want to make gingerbread cookies. I didn't want to hang up decorations. I didn't want to sing carols with my cousins. I just wanted my parents back together. And I found myself a bit resentful toward my cousins who didn't have a broken family. So I just watched them play happy families and found myself feeling an anger that I had never felt before. This anger that made me hide away in the cramped room and simmer on my sadness. It wasn't my cousin's fault that their parents were together and mine weren't, yet I couldn't help but resent them for it, especially my youngest cousin, Lenny. Thinking back on it, he didn't do anything wrong, but being the youngest, he was the easiest to target. In previous years, I found his clumsiness and silliness funny, but now it annoyed me. When he spilled his juice or got crumbs everywhere, the adults doted on him, and his dad doted on him. But when I left my plate unwashed, my mom scowled at me and told me to stop making life difficult for her. My mom reflected her sadness onto me, and in turn, I reflected my anger onto Lenny. I teased him about his whiny voice. I hid his toys, and I tripped him, and I pushed him on multiple occasions. He could have snitched on me, but he didn't. I mean, he never even said a word. He was a good kid, and he did not deserve his horrific fate. A nightmare fate that I chose for him. By Christmas morning, my mood had even worsened. My cousins seemed to be surrounded by an endless pile of foiled paper. I didn't have as many presents as them, but all I wanted was for my parents to get back together. And this did not happen. Instead, I stared with envy at Lenny as his dad helped him try on his new coat, bright red, his favorite color, with patchwork dinosaurs on it. He insisted on keeping it on over breakfast, and he dipped the sleeve in his pancake syrup. Everyone laughed along with him. Everyone except for me. In my eyes, he got away with everything, while I had nothing. We had this Christmas tradition where my grandma My mom and my aunt, they would stay behind and they would start cooking the Christmas dinner, while the rest of us, we would do a loop through the forest that was on my grandparents' land. I didn't want to go on this walk with Lenny or the others, but Mom told me to stop being difficult and that it was a family tradition that meant a lot to my grandpa. I screamed at her that it wasn't fair and that I had to stick to these stupid traditions when she had broken the one where my dad would be here. I saw the hurt in her eyes and I stormed out of the house. I trudged after my family toward the tree line and feeling that blistering cold itching my face, but noting how it wasn't as cold as my own bitterness. Lenny lingered back with me. He seemed determined to stick close to me. A flash of red and dinosaurs in my troubled mind. I cursed at him. I tripped him up in the snow. I called him names, but he still didn't get the hint and leave me alone. One of my pushes was definitely too hard, and it sent him tumbling face first over a branch into the snow. And as he cried out, his dad appeared, lifted him to his feet, brushed the snow off him, and asked him if he was okay. I saw that love in his dad's eyes, and I felt a new bout of anger. Before I had time to think through my actions, I was running away from our usual route and beyond the massive trees. And my only thought back then was just to get away from my pain. I had no inclination at the time that I was running into a nightmare. As I trudged up this incline through the snow, I felt good about my decision. It was spiteful, but I wanted to ruin their day. I wanted them to feel as distraught as I did. Only the more that I walked, the more I soon realized that I didn't even know where I was. I was surrounded by snow-covered trees and towering mountains, but nothing looked familiar. My anger may have led me there, but now my fear set in. I panicked as I ran through these trees, desperately calling out for my family. And the limp spruce branches and endless layers of snow twinkled in sameness. My anger seeped through my fear, and I picked up a twig and I threw it at a tree, and it clattered into it, causing snow to shudder down all around me. I dodged out of the way of the tumbling snow, and then I saw something move ahead of me. I panicked, thinking that it could have been a bighorn sheep or some other creature, and I held my breath. And in front of me, it wasn't an animal, but a man. He had a wispy frame, and he wore gray rags that seemed to move in the breeze. This didn't make any sense. This was a private land, and I'd never seen anyone else out here on our walks before, let alone someone who looked so out of place. So I peeked through the branches and at the man, and as I did so, I heard this wailing, this moaning sound, and at first I thought it was just the wind, but something about that didn't sound right. I guess I wanted to believe that it was the wind, as that would have been far less disturbing than what was actually causing this noise. There was a pattern of some sort in the rag's material. It seemed to move in my eye line, and I thought I saw it bulge forward. I couldn't make it out properly from there, but I saw enough to know that there was something unnatural about his clothing. I stayed very still, my back pressed against the tree. I was lost, and I needed help, but I knew enough to know that this man wasn't there to help me. I don't know how long I'd stayed like that, trying to be still, but it was my fear was escalating in my head. And eventually, I heard low words echo as loudly as that ticking was. I know you are there. I can smell a lost soul from a mile away. I remained exactly where I was. I was too afraid to try and run for it. And I heard crunching through the snow, and I saw that man in gray appear right in front of me. He lowered his head over me, and that curled smile on his thin lips. I shook in fear, my eyes widening in terror at what I was seeing. The sounds that I was hearing weren't the wails and moans of the wind. This close, I saw what was actually on those gray rags. It wasn't a pattern at all. They were faces, dozens of them, their features twisted in pain as they howled and they wailed, trying but failing to burst free of that fabric. I wanted to run, but my feet didn't work properly. I tripped over my own feet and I lay there in the snow, staring up at that man in front of me and his rags of tortured souls. He bent over me and his hand was outstretched. I couldn't bear to look at those faces there on his stretched rags, so I closed my eyes and I dug my gloved hands into the snow. So I thought this was it, and that he was going to take me. I was terrified. But then I heard it, the calling of my name. I opened my eyes and I saw a flash of red coat and patchwork dinosaurs. I gulped back in dread, willing for it to not be who I knew it was. There, out of the trees, stepped Lenny. Lenny looked at that figure staring over me and froze in fear. I wanted to tell him to run, but I didn't do anything. I was paralyzed with fear. The eyes of those trapped faces were looking at me, deformed and grotesque as they tried to wail toward me, stretching the fabric in their distorted, warped face away. This would be terrifying for anyone, let alone a child. I didn't know what to do. And then the man in rags smirked on seeing Lenny, and his dark eyes dilated, as if a wicked idea had suddenly popped into his head. With his hand lingering over me, he calmly said, "I shall let you choose, your soul or his." He turned and he looked at Lenny. I didn't speak at first, and that's when I felt it. It was this grayness surrounded me, and as I felt the life was being sucked out of me, all I could hear were those wails and the groans of the trapped faces. I didn't want to be like them. I looked at Lenny and I saw his small frame shaking, and I looked away as the shaky words left my mouth. Take him. I didn't mean to say what I said, but I was petrified. I saw that gray man's curled smile as he turned away from me, and along with his rags of shrieking souls, he crunched his way through that snow toward Lenny. Aware of what I had just done, I scrambled to my feet and I croaked out, "Lenny, run!" But it was too late. I saw the silent terror on Lenny's face as that man reached him. I saw a blur of his red jacket with the patchwork dinosaurs on it, and then they both seemed to just sink into the snow and away from me. I heard the wails and the moans of the faces disappear beneath the snow. I heard them as the wind roared around me, and then, through that coldness, I heard the calls of my name. My uncle found me shivering by a tree. My hand was gripped around a branch, and the sharp spruce needles were digging through my glove into my flesh, and blood splattered the woolly material and left its mark in the snow. But all that was left of Lenny was his red coat, lying in the snow. And then my uncle saw it, he ran over to it, and then he just held it up, and he cradled it as he shouted his son's name. Shouts that to me sounded like wails and moans. Shouts that replayed in my head long after they stopped. They spent all day looking for Lenny, but they never found him. And I never did tell anyone about the man in gray. I buried it deep in my mind because it was easier that way. It was easier than facing truth. Me and Mom still went to my grandparents' ranch each year for Christmas, but my cousins never did. And we never walked in the woods before Christmas dinner. Never again. I used to stare out of the window and convince myself that I'd seen a flash of red amid the snowdrifts, and the distant sound of wails and moans caught in the howling wind. Even though I buried the truth deep in my mind, I always knew it. I always knew that I was to blame. Despite extensive searches of the forest and the mountains surrounding the ranch, Lenny Quinn was never found, and it was assumed that he froze to death and a cougar or another wild animal had taken his body. On rediscovering the truth, Joel Hawke has since told his family what happened that day in the wild. It's a truth that they are reluctant to believe. Although there have been no other reported sightings of this man in gray rags in Wyoming, there have been many sightings of malevolent beings over the centuries, ones that take many different forms. It's widely believed that those with a heart full of resentfulness are more likely to entice malevolent forces toward them. Joel Hawke, of course, blamed himself for bringing the gray-ragged man into his cousin's life. Given the choice, instead of accepting his fate, he chose to switch places with an innocent boy with no malice in his heart. But that remains a choice that no one, especially not a child, should ever have to make. What do you think drew the force into the family's world? The characters are complex and the situation even more so. So your comments will help so we can all have Christmas walks without having to worry about the man in gray. And for more scary horror stories, please subscribe.